My parents would not give me $95,000 to save my dying son, but they did not hesitate to spend $330,000 on my sister's wedding like it was nothing 5 years ago when I was standing in the cold, sterile hallway of an Atlanta hospital. I still believed family meant something. I was wrong. My name is Ebony. I am 34 years old, and I am now known in Washington, D.C. as one of the most ruthless crisis managers in the industry. People pay me millions to fix their disasters, but what no one knows is that I became this way because of the most painful betrayal a mother could ever experience. It all started on a day I will never forget. My son, Malik, was fighting for his life against a rare form of leukemia. He had already gone through so much, and now his only hope was an immunotherapy treatment that cost $95,000. Insurance would not cover it, and I had already exhausted every resource I had. I sold my furniture, my jewelry, everything I owned. I even worked 2 jobs just to keep up with hospital bills. But the money I needed was still out of reach, so I turned to the people who should have been there for me, my parents, Bernard and Vivian. They had more money than they could spend. My father was a successful real estate mogul and the head deacon of one of the biggest churches in the city. My mother sat on multiple charity boards. They walked through life like royalty, always polished, always perfect, always flaunting their wealth and power. I found them in the VIP lounge of a private wellness clinic where they were getting vitamin drips just for energy. I stormed in wearing my scrubs from my transcription job, with unwashed hair and cracked hands shaking from exhaustion and desperation. Bernard was reading the Wall Street Journal. He did not even lower it at first. He just looked up and frowned at the sight of me like I was something unpleasant that had wandered in from the street. I dropped the hospital invoice on the table between us and pleaded. I told them Malik only had a few weeks left. I told them this was his only chance. I told them I had nothing left. My father adjusted his silk tie and took a slow sip from his glass of sparkling water before looking at the invoice like it was some underperforming investment portfolio. He sighed and said in that deep voice he used on Sunday mornings, "Ebony, you have to be realistic. $95,000 is a lot of money for a child who has always been frail. We do not have that kind of liquidity. All our capital is tied up in development projects and trust funds. It is not wise to liquidate assets for something with no guarantee." He looked straight through me like Malik was a number and nothing more. I turned to my mother. She was scrolling on her iPad, tapping with a diamond-tipped stylus. "Vivian," I begged, "he is your first grandchild. He asks for you every day." My mother finally looked up, her makeup flawless, her lips pursed in irritation. "Ebony," she said calmly, "you are being overly emotional. Chantal and Brad's wedding is in 4 weeks, and we have obligations. You are forgetting that we are entertaining the Vanderbilts. These people expect sophistication and refinement. We cannot start pulling funds at the last minute. It will look like we are struggling, and we cannot appear poor in front of Brad's family. That would be social suicide." I fell to my knees right there in that sterile, pristine room on a Persian rug that probably cost more than my car. I grabbed her hand and said, "Please, I am begging you. This is about Malik, not a party, not flowers, not status. He is just a child." My father stood and straightened his suit, brushing invisible lint off the sleeve. "Ebony, lower your voice. You are embarrassing us. We will pray for Malik, but we will not sacrifice our dignity or standing. Please clean yourself up. You look unwell, and you smell of desperation." I walked out of that room, and something in me shattered. I was still alive, but I was no longer whole. I had begged, I had humiliated myself, and it did not matter to them. I became a machine in the following days, a creature made of grit and panic. I sold my wedding ring, I sold my old car, and took the bus. I took a third job cleaning offices at night. I rented out my apartment to traveling nurses and started sleeping in my car, parked outside the hospital. I ate crackers from the vending machine to save money while watching my son fade away in a hospital bed. Upstairs, while I suffered and sacrificed the family group chat titled Black Excellence buzzed like a cruel joke. They were posting constant updates about the wedding, Chantal's dress, fittings, the imported orchids from Thailand, the helicopter entrance, the custom crystal tiara, the Vera Wang gown that alone cost $15,000. Every single update was like a dagger, especially the one with the flower receipt, $50,000 for orchids that would be dead within a day. I was sitting in my cold car with my coat pulled over me to stay warm when that notification came in. $50,000. That was over half of what I needed Save Malik. I tried to type a message to the group. I started writing, "Please help, he is getting worse." But before I could hit send, Chantal posted a video of her trying on the diamond tiara. She giggled and said, "Perfection. It completes the look." I deleted my message. I realized I was background noise. Their perfect lives static that they had learned to tune out. They were too high on their own fantasy to see the pain beneath them. The night of the rehearsal dinner was the worst night of my life. Rain poured over Atlanta like the sky was crying for me. Malik had been moved to the ICU. His organs were beginning to fail. I sat next to him, holding his hand, whispering stories and promises I could not keep. I called Chantal through video, desperate for a glimpse of empathy. She answered on the third ring. She was glowing in a restaurant, surrounded by wine glasses and laughter, wearing a white cocktail dress that cost more than my hospital bills. "Hey sis," she said, not even looking at the camera. She was checking her teeth in a compact mirror. "Brad is about to give a toast, so make it quick." I told her Malik was seizing, that he might not make it through the night, that this was our last chance to help him. She frowned and shifted her camera to get better lighting. "Ebony, seriously," she said, "you are being selfish. This is my wedding week. And do you know how stressed I am? The seating chart is a nightmare. And now you call me with this heavy energy. Dad already said no. You have to accept God's will. Do not bring this negativity into my celebration. Brad's parents are watching. I cannot look upset. It ruins the aesthetic." I whispered, "He is dying, Chantal." She shrugged. "Everyone dies eventually. Look, I have to go. Brad is standing up. Love you, bye." And the call ended and the screen went black, and the only sound left was the slow fading beep of Malik's heart monitor. I did not call again. I just sat there and held my son and told him about stars and sang his favorite song and promised him love enough to last beyond breath. At 3 in the morning, he exhaled and never inhaled again. There was no dramatic moment. Just silence. His tiny chest stopped moving, and his grip faded, and the room became unbearably still. A nurse entered and turned off the machines with gentle, quiet hands, and I walked out at dawn holding a plastic bag with his pajamas and stuffed bear, and stood in the rain at the bus stop. I checked my phone one last time, hoping for something, anything, a message, a call. Instead, I saw my mother's Instagram story, posted just minutes before. It was a selfie in a gold eye mask, captioned, "Rested and ready for the wedding of the century. So blessed to have a perfect family. Hashtag mother of the bride." I did not scream. I did not cry. I felt the cold bloom in my chest, a permanent frost. The Ebony who begged was gone. The Ebony who wanted their love was gone. In my purse I found the cheap brochure for a cremation service, and next to it the glossy invitation to a vineyard wedding in Napa Valley. I stared at both and made a vow right there, soaked in rain. They used what could have saved my son to buy their reputation. They paid for orchids and tiaras with my boy's breath. I would let them have their party, but one day I would take back everything they bought with blood money. I buried Malik 2 days later in a public cemetery, just me and a pastor. No flowers, no choir, no family as they cut the wedding cake. I dropped the first handful of dirt onto a child-sized coffin. I imagined my father toasting to family values, and I walked away from that cemetery, a different woman. I packed one bag and flew to Washington, D.C. I did not tell them. I did not look back. At 3:14 in the morning, Malik died, and so did the last shred of softness inside me. No final words, no miracle, no check, just a high-pitched monitor tone, and the knowledge that I had been left alone by the very people who should have protected us. The silence that followed Malik's last breath was the kind of silence that lives in your bones and never leaves, and as I sat there holding his body limp and cooling, I knew that no one else in the world knew that he was gone. Not yet, not the doctors, not the world, not my family. I needed to tell someone, because saying it out loud would make it real, and for some reason, despite everything, despite the cruelty, I still thought maybe, just maybe, my father would care. I picked up my phone. My fingers were numb, barely able to tap the screen. I called Bernard, my father, the man who once cradled Malik in his arms like he was the most precious thing in the world. It rang 4 times, then he answered, and I could hear clinking glasses and muffled jazz in the background. He was not asleep, he was out celebrating. "Who is this?" he said, his voice sharp and irritated, like he had been interrupted from something "Important, Dad," I whispered. "It is Ebony. Malik is gone." The line went quiet for a second, then I heard him cover the phone and muffle the noise on the other end, but I could still hear it, the laughter, the clatter of ice, the sound of men enjoying the spoils of power. When he returned, his voice was lower. Harsh. "Keep your voice down, Ebony. I am with Brad's father at the club finishing our drinks. Did you hear me? I asked again. Malik is dead. He died tonight. I heard you," he said curtly, "and there is no reason to make a scene. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. If he is gone, then that was God's will. There is nothing more to be said." I sat in stunned silence, staring at the wall, unable to process what I had just heard. He was talking about his grandson like he was a stock that had crashed, and now it was time to cut losses. He continued coldly, "Handle the arrangements, Cole. The funeral home. Do not involve your mother. She needs her rest for the ceremony tomorrow. We do not want the Vanderbilts hearing about this. Do you understand? Do not let this tragedy overshadow your sister's moment." He hung up, and just like that, I was alone again, not just in the hospital room, but in the world. There was no one coming, no one mourning, no one who would show up for Malik. I put the phone down on the side table beside Malik's glasses, which still held a smudge from his fingers. I looked out the window at the gray sky over Atlanta. The rain was still falling, not a gentle drizzle, but a pounding storm, as if the city itself was mourning my son's death. I felt like an orphan, not legally, but in spirit. My parents had buried me emotionally long before this, and now they had buried my son too. I made the arrangements on my own. I chose the cheapest casket, the simplest service. There was no point in pretending anymore. No one was going to come the day of the funeral. The rain did not stop. The mud in the cemetery clung to my shoes as I walked through it. The pastor, a kind, tired man with watery eyes, read psalms over the closed pine box as water dripped from the brim of his hat. Only 4 chairs were set up under a sagging green tent. 3 of them remained empty the entire time. I had texted the time and place to my parents. I thought, maybe, just maybe, the finality of death would reach them. Maybe they would realize the gravity of what they had done. But they never came. The only other living soul nearby was a stray dog sitting under an oak tree, trying to stay dry. I gripped a single white rose in my hand so tightly that the thorns cut into my palm. The blood mixed with the rain, and it felt like penance. I pulled out my phone and checked it, hoping for some message of apology, some miracle. Instead, I saw a new story on my mother's Instagram. I opened it and was instantly blinded by sunlight. She was on a balcony in Napa Valley, wrapped in a silk robe with Chantal at her side, both holding flutes of champagne and laughing. The caption said, "We are finally here, ready for the most important day of my life. Wedding of the century. Napa vibes. #blessed." I stared at the screen, then looked at the muddy hole in front of me where Malik's coffin sat. It hit me that this was it. This was who they were. The most important day of her life was not the day she became a grandmother. It was not the day her grandson died. It was the day she could pose for pictures with the Vanderbilts. I dropped the rose onto the coffin. It landed with a soft thud, and I whispered, "Good bye, Malik. I promise you they will pay for every drop of this rain. I promise you their champagne will become poison and their legacy will rot." I walked away from the grave and never looked back. I did not cry. I did not scream. I walked to the bus stop, drenched in rain and fury. I flew to California and rented a car. I parked it on a dirt road near the Vineyard Estate, where the wedding was taking place. I was not on the guest list, of course. My mother had told me months earlier that my presence would ruin the mood, that I carried grief like a disease that might infect the celebration. I walked through rows of grapevines until I had a view of the estate. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the lawn. Guests in designer dresses and expensive suits sipped champagne while laughing at things that did not matter. The smell of roasted meat filled the air. I watched as a helicopter descended from the sky, scattering thousands of white rose petals over the guests. The petals fluttered like snow and covered the lawn in a soft white blanket. It was a stunt that cost $8,000, and all I could think was that it could have bought 2 months of medication for Malik, and that they chose flowers instead of a future. I saw Chantal walk down the aisle, stepping on petals that cost more than my son's final week of life. I crept closer, hiding behind a tree near the reception tent. A waiter poured golden champagne into a tower of glasses. It sparkled like treasure, and in the center of it all stood Brad, holding a cigar-looking board. One of his groomsmen laughed and said, "Your in-laws really pulled out all the stops. This is it." Bit much. Brad smirked, took a drag from his cigar, and said, "It is pathetic really, they are so desperate to look rich. It is obviously new money, they try so hard, look at them, practically serving drinks themselves. But hey, at least they are willing to spend." I looked at my parents, my father running around, refilling glasses in his tuxedo drenched in sweat, my mother laughing too hard at everything. Brad's mother said, fanning her like a servant, they had let my son die to impress these people. And they were not even respected, they were mocked and used and tolerated. I felt something harden in my chest. There was no pain anymore, just clarity. I turned away and walked back to my rental car. I was not sad, I was focused. I drove to the edge of the estate and stood by the iron gates with one hand holding a menu card I had grabbed from a server's tray. It was embossed in gold with a list of dishes: truffle, risotto, wagyu beef, lobster, covered in edible gold dust. The wine alone was $500 a bottle. I looked at the other hand where I held Malik's preliminary death certificate, printed on cheap paper, listing his cause of death and age 7 years old. His life summarized in a few cold lines. I looked back and forth between the two papers and realized I was holding proof of the deal they made. They traded his life for gold dust and wine. They bought a party with his breath. I tore the menu in half, then again and again, until it was confetti, and let it fall into the mud. "You want status?" I whispered. "Then I will give it to you. Build your tower as high as you can, and I will be the one to take it down brick by brick." I got back in the car and began planning. I would not let them win, not like this. They turned their backs on their own blood for vanity, and I would make sure the world knew the cost of their perfection. I made myself a promise that day by the vineyard gates that I would not just move on or forget. I would come back stronger, sharper, and I would dismantle everything my parents had built on the bones of my child. They paid for their prestige with blood, and I would use that same prestige to bury them. I drove away from the estate in silence, my clothes soaked in rain, my body still and cold, and my mind already calculating the next move. I sat in the car for hours thinking and thinking, with Malik's death certificate still tucked into my coat and the pieces of that gold leaf menu still stuck to my wet shoes. I knew I could not beat them with grief. I had to beat them with power, and to gain power I needed to disappear and rebuild myself into someone they would never see coming. I went home, packed one suitcase, and got on the first flight to Washington, D.C. with $400 to my name and no plan except one: I would rise. I landed in the city of suits and sharks and lies, with no job, no connections, and no place to stay. I found a moldy basement apartment in a neighborhood where ambition was more dangerous than poverty. It smelled like wet paint and disappointment, but I made it mine. I started from the bottom. I got a job answering phones at a small PR agency that handled political damage control. I was the first to arrive each morning at 6, and the last to leave, sometimes close to midnight. I got coffee, I cleaned up, I filed things, and I listened. I watched the way power worked in silence. I learned how the powerful twisted truth into survival. I memorized their methods, how they buried scandals, rewrote narratives, turned criminals into martyrs, and turned victims into ghosts. Every day I walked home alone, and every night I sat at my desk staring at the only photo of Malik. I allowed myself to keep a small picture of him in his superhero pajamas, grinning at me like he still believed in goodness. I would touch the glass and whisper, "Just wait, baby, just wait, I am coming for them." I turned my grief into fire, and that fire became fuel. I stopped being Ebony the forgotten daughter. I became Ebony the machine. I read every book on political warfare, media, spin, and psychological manipulation. I enrolled in night classes to study crisis management and behavioral psychology. I took consulting gigs on the side, helping desperate clients rewrite their stories. I watched the rich fall apart and taught them how to look whole. I built my skills until people with real money and real secrets started calling me. I was good, too good soon. I was being paid to fix the careers of senators and tech giants and billionaires. I learned to move in silence and dress like a weapon. 7 years passed, and I had become unrecognizable even to myself. I stood at the glass wall of my own corner office in a high-rise that I owned, staring down at the ants on the streets below. My name was whispered in boardrooms and political back rooms. I was the woman people called when they had blood on them. hands and needed a clean image. They called me the fixer. Some said I had no soul, others said I had survived hell and come out with ice in my veins. They were both right. I wore tailored suits that cost more than my sister's wedding gown and drove a custom Porsche that I paid for in cash. I owned 3 companies under shell names and had $10 million across offshore accounts, but I did not flaunt it. I did not post selfies or throw parties. I lived like a shadow, sharp, quiet, and always watching, and most importantly, I had not forgotten them, not for a second. My parents and my sister thought I had disappeared into poverty. They thought I was living in some broken-down studio, or maybe homeless. They had written me off as a bitter, failed woman who would never recover. I let them think that because it was useful I never contacted them. I never left a trail, but I watched. I paid a private investigator to track them for years. I had a folder on my laptop labeled family, and every week I read the updates like chapters in a dark comedy. Their social feeds were still filled with staged perfection, smiling brunches, charity galas, white roses on white tablecloths, but behind the curtain cracks were spreading, and I could see them widening, and I waited the way a hunter waits for the perfect shot. And then one day I opened the newest report and smiled for the first time in months. The trap was ready. The folder on my desk that day smelled like fresh paper and old justice. It was thick, filled with bank statements, surveillance photos, transcripts, and financial analyses. The investigator had compiled everything, and what I saw inside that folder was not just failure, it was poetic collapse. Chantal and Brad, the golden couple, were rotting from the inside. The photos showed her looking thin and hollow, her eyes empty, her lips curled in forced smiles. Her social media still showed her in couture and heels, but the reality was darker. The report revealed her credit cards were maxed. She had no job, no education, and no real skills. She was spending recklessly on designer things she did not wear, on gifts she gave to influencers who never followed back. She was drowning in shallow water and pretending it was a pool. Brad was worse, not just cruel but smug about it. He had not only cheated on Chantal, he had done so loudly and without shame. The photos showed him with a woman who looked like Chantal used to look before her spirit was crushed, before her eyes stopped shining. He laughed about my parents at his country club. He called Bernard the butler and Vivian the clown. He told his friends marrying into our family was like rescuing a stray dog. His words were poison, and Chantal knew about the affairs. The report confirmed she had found receipts, found hotel keys, but stayed anyway. She had no escape. She was too deep in a life built on nothing but illusions and glitter and silence. And then I turned to the section on my parents, Bernard and Vivian Vance, the royal couple of Atlanta. Black excellence incarnate, the image of perfect family values. Their financial summary was a bloodbath. They had taken a third mortgage on the family estate. To pay for that wedding, they had never paid it off, just refinanced it again. And again, hoping no one would notice, they had drained their retirement accounts, bet on risky developments, and invested in scams. My father had poured his last remaining assets into a property scheme that collapsed, leaving him with nothing but lawsuits. He had even started borrowing from the church funds to cover their lifestyle. The report included a breakdown of their immediate financial crisis, and at the very bottom was a line item that made my heart stop. They needed exactly $95,000 to prevent an audit from triggering that would reveal the embezzlement my father had pulled from his own congregation. If they did not return the funds by Friday, the board would contact the federal authorities and Bernard would face decades in prison. $95,000, the exact amount I had begged them for to save Malik 7 years earlier. The irony was so sharp. I laughed alone in my office, the kind of laugh that comes from a place deeper than humor. It was not just justice, it was balance. The world had finally tilted in my direction. They were desperate. Now they were out of friends, out of credit, out of options. I knew exactly what they would do next. They would pretend they still loved me. They would crawl back thinking I will still that girl crying on the hospital floor. They would assume I still needed their approval. I sat back and waited. And when the knock came on my door 2 days later, I was ready. It was Thursday night, just past 7. I was not in my penthouse or my office. I was in the basement apartment I had rented just for this moment. I sat on the lumpy couch in faded jeans and a stretched-out sweater, no makeup, no perfume, my hair tied in a messy bun. The air smelled like old coffee and dust. Everything was staged perfectly. The doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there they were, Bernard and Vivian, standing under an umbrella, looking out of place and uncomfortable. My mother clutched her designer purse like it was life support, and my father kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone might recognize him. "Are you going to let us in?" Vivian snapped. "Or do you want the neighbors to hear us?" I stepped aside. They walked in, wrinkling their noses at the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling. "We are not here for a social visit," Bernard said coldly. "We need a temporary loan, a cash flow issue, nothing major." "How much?" I asked quietly. $95,000, he said without blinking. I had to bite my tongue to stop from laughing. It was like the universe had written this scene for me. Vivian stepped forward. "Ebony, you do not need that money for yourself. You have no husband, no children, nothing to spend on. We heard you had a windfall from a lottery ticket. It is not earned money, and you have been living in this hovel for years, so give us this gift. It is the least you can do." I nodded slowly, pretending to tremble. I said I had it tied up in a certificate of deposit that would mature tomorrow. They begged, they snapped, they postured and threatened, and finally I said I would give them the money, but only if they came to my company's gala the next evening and accepted it on stage as part of a public donation. They hesitated, but I saw the calculation behind their eyes, and they agreed, thinking they could spin it as philanthropy. They had no idea what I had planned. They left without saying thank you. I closed the door and stripped off the old sweater and threw it in the trash. I called my assistant Marcus and gave the signal protocol. Red Wedding was live. I told him to expand the guest list to include every major newspaper, every gossip blogger, every church board member, and especially the Vanderbilts. I told him to phrase it as a story about Black excellence and generational wealth and community resilience. The headlines would write themselves. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I created a presentation file and called it "The Cost of Excellence." The first slide was a hospital bill from the night Malik died, $95,000 unpaid. I placed it beside a wedding receipt for $50,000 in orchids, purchased the day he fell into a coma. I added photos of Malik pale in a hospital bed, and beside that a photo of Chantal under a helicopter raining petals. I scanned in every text, every cruel message, every receipt that proved how they had spent a child's life like pocket change. I saved the file and closed the laptop. I stood by the window and looked out over the city lights, my heart steady, my eyes clear. Tomorrow, I would not just expose them, I would end them. They had reached the end of the road, and there was no one left to save them. No more friends to call, no more banks to fool, no more masks to wear. They could not ask Brad, because admitting financial ruin would destroy the marriage they had sacrificed everything to preserve. They could not go to their elite friends because they had already burned those bridges with years of pretending to be something they were not. Their cred, it was ruined, their assets were drained, their masks were slipping, and they were just two scared frauds standing on the edge of ruin. The only option left was the daughter they had abandoned, the same daughter they left sobbing on a hospital floor, the same daughter they once told smelled like desperation, and as predictable as I knew they would be, they came crawling back right on schedule. I had planned for every detail, timed everything to perfection. The knock on the door came at exactly 7 in the evening on Thursday, just under 24 hours before the deadline that would trigger the church audit. I sat on that scratchy beige couch in the rented basement apartment, still dressed in my disguise, faded jeans, pilled sweater hair, tied back, skin bare of makeup, air thick with the musty scent of old carpet and coffee filters. I opened the door, and there they stood, Bernard and Vivian Vance, proud peacocks now soaked in rain and wilted under the weight of fear. They looked like relics lost in time. My mother's heels clicked on the worn linoleum as she entered, clutching her designer bag like a relic from a life that was slipping through her fingers. My father stepped in behind her, his polished shoes too shiny for a place like this, his eyes scanning the apartment in disbelief. They were visibly uncomfortable, out of place, drowning in the stench of humility. "We did not come here to reminisce," Bernard said without making eye contact. "We are in a bind, temporary, a liquidity issue, nothing more. We just need a small short-term loan." I leaned on the kitchen counter like I had nothing to lose. "How much do you need?" He hesitated, but then spoke clearly. $95,000. I almost smiled. The number fell from his lips like poison, and I tasted justice in my mouth. I forced myself to look concerned. I made my hands tremble a little, just enough to seem unsure. That is almost everything I have, I whispered. My mother scoffed. You have no expenses, she said harshly. You have no family, no responsibilities. We heard you won a lottery ticket or something. You have been living in this hole for 7 years. What else could you possibly need that money for? The words cut deeper than any blade. She was using Malik's death as evidence that I had no use for compassion, and therefore no right to keep what little I had. I took a deep breath. I have been saving for a house, I lied. Maybe a fresh start. My father laughed, a short, sharp sound. A house, you need to understand. We are offering you something priceless. This is your redemption, your chance to come back. The family, you give us this, and we will consider inviting you back into our lives, maybe even Thanksgiving this year. The arrogance in their faces was breathtaking. They thought I still wanted them. They thought they were throwing me a rope when they were the ones drowning. I looked down, pretended to be moved, and then I said, I want to help, but I cannot withdraw the funds until tomorrow, when my certificate matures. If I do it today, I lose the interest. They panicked. Bernard's voice snapped. We do not have time for that. The auditors come on Monday, and we have to move now. I pretended to think that nodded slowly. Okay, but only if we do it right. I want everyone to know that I helped the family. I want public acknowledgement. I want a gesture. I want something that cannot be denied. Tomorrow night, my company is holding a 10-year anniversary gala at the Grand Mox Hotel. I am supposed to give a speech about overcoming adversity. I want you to attend, all of you, Dad, Chantal, and Brad. I want to hand over the check publicly. We will call it a Family Resilience Fund. It will look good for everyone. My mother narrowed her eyes. What kind of event is this? We do not want to be seen at some small office party. It will be very tasteful. I said I will have a table reserved for you near the stage front and center. You will look like heroes. They exchanged a look, and I could see the gears turning. This was their specialty after all. Performance. If nothing else, they knew how to fake it, and they smelled opportunity. Fine, Bernard said. Make sure it looks expensive. We cannot be associated with mediocrity. Wear something decent, Vivian added, and do not embarrass us by dragging it out. We expect the check promptly. They walked out without saying thank you, assuming they had won. I waited until they were out of sight, then tore off my disguise and tossed it into the trash. I went to the bathroom and scrubbed the sweat and makeup from my face. I put on the war paint, eyeliner, sharp lipstick, dark, the look of someone ready for blood. I picked up my encrypted phone and called Marcus. We are a go, I said quietly but with fire in my voice. Initiate protocol. Red wedding. Understood. He replied, I want every major press out. Let there, I said. Washington Post, city paper, the celebrity bloggers, to tell them the Vance family is making a major announcement regarding generational wealth and community rebuilding. Use all the buzzwords. Let them come hungry and hopeful. They will not know what hit them. I want the full board of deacons from Greater Hope Baptist Church. There, tell them Bernard has arranged a donor to resolve the building fund issue. They will come early and expect a miracle. Invite the senior executives from the Vanderbilt Hotel Group to tell them Brad is being honored for his charitable contributions. Make sure Brad's parents come. They need to see who they really married into. I hung up and sat down at my desk and began loading the gun digitally. I opened my laptop and launched the presentation software, the one I had named the Cost of Excellence. I imported the high-resolution scan of the hospital invoice, $95,000 due for Malik's immunotherapy. I enlarged it, made the text red, stamped, declined across it. I added the wedding invoice, next orchids, champagne, helicopters, Vera Wang, a total of $330,000, all paid in full one day after the treatment was denied. I added side-by-side photos of Malik in a hospital bed, next to Chantal laughing under falling petals. I imported texts, my mother saying not to ruin the aesthetic, my father telling me to keep the funeral quiet. I arranged them chronologically, each one a nail in their coffin, each one a crack in their perfect facade. I added a screenshot of my mother's story from the day Malik died, her in a gold eye mask, captioned most important day of my life. I arranged the visuals into a brutal, clean timeline, a narrative of silence, cruelty, and social ambition that ended in death. I saved the file and closed the laptop. The weight of what I had built was heavy in my chest, but it did not slow me down. This was not revenge for me. This was a reckoning. I stood by the window and whispered, To Malik, we are almost there, baby. Tomorrow. They fall the next morning. I got a call from Chantal, not a word of greeting, no apology. She simply launched into a demand. Mom says we have to go to your thing at the hotel. If I have to be seen with you, I need something nice to wear, a real dress, not off. Rack. Brad's parents might be there, and I need to look like a Vanderbilt. I kept my tone meek. I might be able to help. I said I know someone who deals in vintage couture. I will send something over today. It is one of a kind. She sounded pleased. Fine, make sure it is size 2, and make sure it is not cheap. I hung up and walked to my closet. I pulled out the dress I had prepared weeks ago, a gold sequined gown bought for $50 from a bankrupt theater company. I had a tailor alter it, and sew in a fake Italian label. It looked expensive, but the material was scratchy, the lining uncomfortable. It was costume, nothing more, and it was perfect. I sent it by courier and then opened the audio feed from the bug planted in their living room. I listened as Chantal opened the box and squealed, "Oh my God, look, Brad." She cried. She really spent a fortune. "This is stunning," Brad replied lazily. "Looks decent, maybe. Your sister is not a total failure." I listened as Chantal twirled around the room in the costume, so easily bought, so easy to fool. Then I heard the words that sealed her fate. She said quietly to Brad, "We just go to the event, let her give them the check, and then we bounce early. I just want to be seen." Getting out of the limo, Brad laughed and said, "Sounds like a plan. Get the money and run." I took off the headphones and looked at the screen with their voices still echoing in my head. They still thought they were in control. They still believed I was beneath them. They had no idea they were dressing up for their own funeral tomorrow. I thought and smiled. Tomorrow the lights go out. The Grand Marks Hotel stood like a gleaming monument to everything they worshipped, all glass and gold and valet parking and crystal chandeliers, a place built to make people feel small if they did not belong. I arrived early, walking through the service entrance dressed in a sleek black gown that shimmered like oil under the low lights, my hair pinned in a tight twist, my eyes dark and sharp. I looked like vengeance, dressed as elegance. I checked the sound system, the lighting, the cue points for the slideshow. Everything had to run perfectly. The room was set for 200 guests with curved white chairs around circular tables dressed in navy and silver. The floral centerpieces were minimalist white orchids with long black stems, a quiet mockery of the wedding's overindulgence. I made sure their table was closest to the stage front and center the 4 seats marked with gold name cards. Bernard, Vivian, Chantal, Brad. I checked my phone and watched the trackers. They were on their way. The limos had left the estate at exactly 6:30. As scheduled, I stood at the top of the grand staircase, waiting like a statue as guests began to arrive. The first wave was pressed, sleek men in suits, women with microphones and clipboards and lenses strapped across their shoulders. Then came the social elite, hotel owners, CEO, board members from Greater Hope Baptist Church. Every one of them had received personal invites with golden seals promising an announcement that would redefine legacy wealth and reconciliation. By 7:15, the ballroom was buzzing with anticipation. A jazz trio played near the fountain, and servers walked in perfect silence, offering glasses of wine and trays of tiny hors d'oeuvres. Then the door opened, and they entered. First came my mother, dressed in emerald silk, with diamond earrings that caught every light, her chin high, her smile wide. She scanned the room quickly, nodding at faces she recognized, soaking in the attention. Beside her, my father, in a charcoal suit, hand on her back. Like he still had control. They posed for photos. They greeted the pastor. They waved at the Vanderbilt executives like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Behind them came Chantal and Brad. She wore the gown. I sent her a gold sheath that clung to her like desperation. Her hair curled perfectly, her heels sharp and dangerous. Brad looked bored as usual, texting with one hand, sipping champagne with the other. They were escorted to their table, and I let them settle in for 10 minutes, letting them bask in the illusion that they were admired, respected, adored. Then the lights dimmed and the jazz faded, and the spotlight hit the podium in the center of the room, and I walked out measured. Every eye turned toward me, and I saw them all finally seeing me not as the outcast, not as the tragedy, but as the architect. I thanked the guests for coming and spoke briefly about resilience, how families sometimes fall, and how love could be tested but never fully destroyed. I could see my Mother smiling, proud, believing she had won. I turned to them, gestured toward their table, and said, "Tonight, I want to honor those who taught me the cost of survival and the price of perfection." A slideshow began behind me, and the first image appeared Malik in a hospital bed, smiling, weakly holding a stuffed elephant. Then another image, the invoice from the hospital, $95,000, due for experimental therapy. Then a third image, denied, across it in bold red letters. I heard a rustle in the crowd, the whispers starting. My mother's smile froze. I continued as the images rolled. Malik, face pale beneath an oxygen mask, his birthday party in the hospital, the email from the insurance company saying the treatment would not be covered, the date of the wedding just 3 days later, and the receipt for the orchid drop and the gold dust on the lobster. I read the numbers out loud. $330,000 on a wedding, $95,000 could have saved a life. The silence in the room turned heavy, suffocating. I clicked again and played a video clip of me calling Bernard from the hospital room on speaker, his voice cold, saying, "Let the boy go, it is God's will." Another clip, my mother saying, "Do not ruin the aesthetic with your grief." The pastor looked like he had been punched in the chest. The Vanderbilt executives leaned forward, confused, then angry. I turned back to the podium and said, "This is not just my story. This is the story of what happens when image matters more than life. This is the story of a boy who was disposable because his suffering did not match the day." I could see my mother rising from her chair, her face pale. I continued, "And now that their legacy is exposed, I will give them a chance to do what they never did before." I walked down steps toward their table, pulled a white envelope from my purse, and laid it in front of my father. Inside was a check for $95,000, the exact amount they once denied. I took the microphone and said loudly, "This is the money you begged for yesterday, the money you came crawling for to save your name, not a child, and now I am giving it to you with one condition. I want you to read aloud the apology I wrote. It is on the card beneath the check." My father's hands trembled. He opened the card, and his face fell. He looked at me, his mouth opened, then closed. I stared back until he stood. Slowly, his voice cracked. He read the words, "I, Ebony Vance, here, by apologize for the death of my son Malik, caused by the negligence, cruelty, and vanity of my parents Bernard and Vivian Vance, who chose wealth over love, appearance over life, silence over truth." My mother gasped, trying to stop him, but he kept going because he saw the faces around the room, and he knew there was no escaping now. Chantal stood up, tried to grab the microphone, but slipped on her heel and hit the floor. Brad rushed to her, but not before the photographers captured the exact moment the golden couple cracked open. I took Mike back and said, "Thank you, Dad. I hope this donation helps you rebuild your reputation. It cannot bring back a child, but maybe it can buy you some forgiveness." I turned to the guests and said, "Enjoy. Your evening dinner is served." And then I walked out the side door, my heels echoing like gunshots down the marble hallway. I did not look back, but I heard the chaos begin behind me, voices shouting, cameras flashing, the buzz of phones as the truth spread like wildfire. I walked to the elevator, rode it to the rooftop, where Marcus was waiting. He handed me a glass of sparkling water and said, "Clean shot." I nodded and said, "Burn the rest." The footage was already uploading. The press had it, the blogs had it, the board of deacons had it. There was no taking it back, no rewriting it. No PR firm could bury this, no favor could erase it. I looked out over the city lights and thought of Malik, his laughter, his courage, his tiny hands gripping mine as we read stories in that cold hospital room. I had not just avenged him, I had rewritten the script they thought they controlled. They built their empire on appearances, and I tore it down with truth. Later that night, I went home and stood in front of my mirror and wiped off the makeup, the war paint, the mask. I looked at my face, raw, honest, unflinching. I whispered to myself, "It is done." And in that moment I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace, not happiness, not joy, but peace, the kind that comes when the storm finally ends and you know you survived. I lay down on the couch, pulled Malik's blanket over me, and closed my eyes, and for the first time in 7 years I slept without nightmares. The fallout began before sunrise, as I expected, because the city never sleeps when blood spills, especially not the kind dressed in designer suits and family shame. By 6 in the morning, the headline was already everywhere. The Vance scandal exploded across screens, newspapers, online platforms. Title was simple but sharp. Former banker parents spend $330,000 on wedding, refuse $95,000 for grand. Son's life. The article opened with Malik's photo beneath it, his birth date, his death date, the hospital invoice, the wedding receipt, and a quote from Bernard about letting God decide. Headlines: Love a villain, and my parents gave them a masterpiece. Social media was vicious, thousands of comments within hours. The story struck a nerve with people across all walks of life. Parents, teachers, nurses, strangers, everyone had an opinion, everyone picked a side. But most of them picked the same side, and it was not my parents'. Photos from the gala showed Chantal on the floor, mid-stumble, Brad looking like he was chasing clout, not love. Bernard's hands shaking as he read the apology, with Vivian staring like her kingdom had turned to ash. The story was not just viral, it was radioactive. Within 24 hours, the board of Greater Hope Baptist Church issued a statement suspending all fundraising activities associated with Bernard Vance pending internal investigation. They requested a formal review of his past involvement in building fund allocations and asked him not to attend services until further notice. It was polite on paper, but humiliating in reality. His phone was silent, the invitations dried up overnight. Vivian's face was removed from the cover of the annual Garden Gala program, with a new headliner announced in her place, Mrs. Dorsey, pastor's wife who once sold pies at the church fair, and whose tears during my slideshow had soaked an entire napkin. The community turned fast and unforgiving. People had long suspected the Vances were fake, but now they had proof, and proof changes everything. The bank Bernard once worked for released a statement too carefully worded, but still distancing themselves from his actions, noting that he had retired years ago, and that his conduct did not reflect their core values. Chantal's world fell just as hard. The wedding sponsors quietly pulled their digital support, removing photos of her wedding from their online galleries, deleting tags, removing her from preferred client lists. Her wedding planner posted a message saying, "We celebrate love with integrity and transparency. We stand with families who value life over luxury." It was brutal and public and beautiful. Brad tried to spin it, of course, claiming the footage was doctored, trying to sue the bloggers for defamation. But the damage was done. His own firm asked him to take a leave of absence to avoid further disruption to the brand. The Vanderbilt family distanced themselves with shocking speed. His mother posted a cryptic message on social media about how marriage requires shared values and hard conversations, which to their circle meant one thing: divorce is coming, and it is coming fast. By the end of the week, Brad had moved into a suite at the Peninsula Hotel, and Chantal was back at the estate with Vivian trying to salvage what remained. I stayed quiet through all of it. I posted nothing, gave no interviews, refused every request to appear on television shows. I let the story speak for itself. I had done what I came to do, and now it was their turn to sit in the silence and hear the truth echo. Marcus checked in daily offerings, updates, media clips, and screenshots from the fallout, but I asked him to stop after day 5. I wanted to live again, not just relive. I spent my mornings at the park, reading Malik's favorite books to the wind. I went back to therapy and started painting again, not as a career, not for money, but just for myself, just for color, just to feel my hands making something that was not built from pain. And then one evening, about 2 weeks later, I received a letter, not an email, not a message, but a letter, real ink, real paper, no return address. The handwriting was sharp and practiced. Inside it simply said, "I will wrong. I am sorry. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I hope you find peace." It was unsigned, but I knew it was from Vivian, not because of the words, but because of what was folded inside: a single photograph taken on Malik's 4th birthday, the only time she ever came to see him in the hospital. She was holding a balloon, her face half turned, her eyes distant, but there was something in her body language, something small, that looked like regret. I stared at it for a long time, wondering whether to keep it or burn it in the end. I placed it in a box along with Malik's drawings, the hospital bracelet, elephant toy, everything I had saved. I wrapped it in velvet, tied it closed, and put it away, not as a trophy, not as evidence, but as a memory I refused to carry on my shoulders anymore. I moved out of the basement apartment, not into a mansion, not into a penthouse, but into a quiet, sunlit place with wide windows and a little balcony that overlooked a bookstore. I spent days arranging the bookshelves, painting the walls in soft colors, placing photos of Malik where I could see them, not to mourn, but to remember, to smile, to feel him there. The money I had kept for the family never went to them, of course. Instead, I used it to fund a pediatric cancer support center in Malik's name, the Malik Vance Resilience Room. It had books, games, counselors, and quiet rooms for parents to cry and not be judged. I worked there 2 days a week organizing art therapy sessions, helping new mothers navigate the fear of diagnosis, telling them it was okay to be angry, okay to break sometimes, okay to grieve out loud. One morning a woman came in. Her son had just started chemo. He was scared. She was shaking. I gave her tea, sat with her on the floor, and said, I know. And for the first time in so long, I was not pretending, not hiding, not fighting. I was just present, just human. I did not see my parents again for months, not until I got a letter from their lawyer stating that they had sold the estate and moved into a smaller property outside the city. They included a copy of a statement they had issued to their remaining circle, acknowledging the choices they made and the pain they caused. There was no request for reconciliation, no plea for reunion, just an acknowledgement. And that was enough for me. They were no longer the story. They were no longer the center. The story was Malik, and the love that survived him, the life that outlived their cruelty, the voice that refused to be silenced in the end. I did not destroy them. I simply told the truth, and the truth did the rest. I was not the daughter they wanted, but I was the one they made, and I had finally become the mother I promised Malik I would be, strong, unbroken, free, and that was the ending I chose to keep. The silence that followed the gala did not feel like peace at first. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm where everything had been ripped apart, and all that remained was debris drifting slowly back to the ground. I stayed out of sight for weeks, letting the consequences unfold without interference, because this part of the story did not belong to me anymore. It belonged to them, to the truth they had tried to bury, and to the people who now saw them clearly. The media cycle was relentless. Every morning brought a new headline, every afternoon another interview, another analysis, another wave of public judgment. Bernard's name became synonymous with hypocrisy and moral rot. The church he once ruled like a kingdom locked its doors to him. His portrait was quietly removed from the hallway of honored deacons, and his sermons scrubbed from the online archive. Donors withdrew funding, and congregants demanded answers. Some cried openly during services, saying they felt betrayed. Others were angrier, calling him a thief who stole from God and children alike. Vivian's social circle collapsed with the speed of a landslide. Invitations stopped coming. Her charity boards voted her out one by one, citing values and public trust. She stopped attending luncheons, stopped posting online, stopped answering calls. The silence she once used as a weapon now consumed her. Chantal tried to maintain the illusion longer than anyone else, posting carefully filtered images of self-care mornings and vague captions about growth and healing, but the comments were brutal. People remembered the video of her telling me not to ruin the aesthetic. People remembered the dress, the fall, the silence when the truth was spoken. Sponsors backed away, and friends vanished. Brad disappeared from her feed entirely, and within months the marriage that had been built on status and spectacle imploded quietly behind closed doors. Legal filings leaked online, confirming the separation, and the division of assets, which was far less impressive than the world had been led to believe. The Vanderbilt name moved on swiftly, issuing no statements and making no effort to defend the connection. They had severed the branch without hesitation. The empire my parents had constructed out of appearances had collapsed under the weight of one unfiltered truth. And yet through all of this I remained invisible. I declined interviews, requests, returned unread messages, and let Marcus handle all communication. I was not interested in victory laps or public sympathy. This was never about applause. It was about balance, about restoring something that had been violently taken from a child who never had a choice. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to reshape itself around the new reality. One afternoon, I received an email from the hospital social worker who had helped me during Malik's final weeks. She told me about a new family struggling under the same diagnosis, a little boy named Isaiah, 6 years old, with the same rare leukemia. His parents were exhausted, uninsured, and terrified, and once again the treatment that offered the best chance was out of reach. I sat staring at the screen, feeling the familiar pressure behind my eyes. But this time it was not despair, it was resolve. I replied within minutes, and transferred the funds needed without hesitation. I did not ask for recognition or a plaque. I asked only that Isaiah receive the care Malik could not, and when I visited the ward, I walked those halls with a steady heart. The machine still beeped, the air still smelled of antiseptic, but I was no longer powerless. Isaiah smiled when I read him the same stories Malik loved, and his mother clutched my hands like a lifeline, whispering thank you over and over. And in that moment I understood something important. The story was no longer about revenge. It had shifted into responsibility. Grief had carved a space inside me. Purpose had filled it. Over the next months, I expanded the Malik Vance Resilience Fund, quietly, steadily creating partnerships with hospitals, counselors, and legal advocates to help families navigate the maze of treatment, approvals, insurance appeals, and emergency housing. I showed up without camera, without speeches, sometimes just to sit with a mother at 3 in the morning when fear felt unbearable. I used my skills not to destroy but to protect, and that felt like breathing again. During this time, I received a handwritten letter forwarded through my attorney. It was from Bernard. The writing was shaky, the words sparse. He admitted nothing fully but acknowledged that the choices he made would haunt him forever. He said losing everything had forced him to confront the man he had become, and that he finally understood what it meant to stand in silence while a child suffered. He did not ask forgiveness, and I did not offer it. I folded the letter, placed it in the box with Malik's drawings, and closed the lid. Some things do not need a response, they need distance. Vivian never wrote, but I heard through others that she had sold most of her jewelry, downsized drastically, and withdrawn from public life. Chantal eventually reached out requesting a meeting. I agreed. After several months, we sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. She looked smaller, older, stripped of the arrogance that once defined her. She cried when she spoke about the wedding, the dress, the choices, the emptiness. She admitted she had been chasing approval and applause because she did not know who she was without them. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I told her that healing did not begin with regret, it began with accountability, and that some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt. She nodded, accepting that truth, and we parted without promises. Time continued its slow march forward. Seasons changed, and the city forgot the scandal, as it always does, but the impact remained in quieter places, in hospital rooms, in support groups, in the lives of children who lived because someone chose differently than my parents had. Isaiah went into remission. His parents sent me a photo of him ringing the bell at the oncology ward, his smile wide and fearless. I cried when I saw it, not from pain, but from something close to joy, and that was enough. I moved into a modest apartment filled with light and books and plants. I painted again, cooked again, slept through the night most days, and on Malik's birthday, I visited the cemetery, brought balloons, and sat on the grass telling him stories about the lives that had changed because of him. I told him that his voice had been heard even when he could no longer speak, that his life mattered beyond measure, and that the world had been forced to listen because of him. I left the cemetery that day lighter, not healed but grounded, knowing that while I could not save my son, I had saved others, and in doing so reclaimed myself. The truth had burned everything away, but what remained was stronger than what was lost, and for the first time since that night in the hospital, I felt something steady inside me, not anger, not grief, but clarity, and that clarity told me the story was finally complete. By the time summer returned, I had settled into a routine that felt quiet but strong. I was not trying to rebuild my old life, I was simply honoring what was left of it. I kept Malik's room just the way it had been, not as a shrine, but as a reminder of love unshaken by time. Sometimes I would sit on his bed and read aloud, pretending he was just in the other room, listening the way he used to do during thunderstorms, when he was too proud to admit. He was scared. The Resilience Fund continued to grow quietly and steadily. More families came through our doors, and more children received the care that parents could never afford on their own. I worked closely with caseworkers, therapists, and a few sympathetic doctors to streamline the referral process. We eliminated paperwork, where we could cut wait times and funded travel for those who had to cross states just to reach a hospital with the right treatment. Every time I saw a child walk out smiling or a mother rest her head in her hands and cry from relief, I felt a piece of Malik's voice echo through me like a ripple of light through darkness. Then one day something unexpected happened. I received a message from a man named Richard Duval. He introduced himself as the director of a nonprofit that specialized in medical legal aid for underprivileged families. He had been following the Resilience Fund's progress and asked if I would consider partnering with them to build a national alliance that could replicate our model in other cities. I read the message twice, unsure if it was real or another PR stunt, but after a background check and a few quiet phone calls, I agreed to meet. We sat down at a coffee shop near the river, and he came with no cameras, no press, no pitch, just a worn notebook and eyes that had seen too much. He told me stories of families who lost their homes trying to save a child, how medical debt was the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the country, and how many of the parents he worked with never got a second chance like I did. He said what I built was not just a program, it was a proof of concept, something that showed what was possible when grief was transformed into purpose. I listened, then told him everything about Malik, about the betrayal, about the silence that followed, and the rage that nearly swallowed me. He did not flinch. He simply nodded and said, "Pain like that can either hollow you out or make you unstoppable. It looks like you chose the latter." We shook hands that day, and by autumn, the National Resilience Network was formed quietly without press or politics. Just a series of signed agreements with hospitals, legal aid offices, and foundations willing to fund treatment without delay. Over the next 4 months, we opened 6 satellite funds in cities across the country, each modeled after the one I had built for Malik, each with counselors and care teams trained not just in medicine, but in empathy. We worked with churches, clinics, and community leaders to identify cases early before desperation became despair. I traveled often not to speak, but to listen to mothers holding children with tubes in their arms, to fathers staring at bills thicker than their paychecks. I told them I had been there, and that they were no longer alone. During one visit to Atlanta, I met a nurse named Michelle who had watched my story unfold during the fallout. She told me that after the gala video went viral, her hospital changed its charity care policy, removing caps for pediatric oncology and reallocating funds to cover rare disease protocols. She said it was not just policy, it was pressure from public eyes. And the story of a boy who had been denied because his life was not deemed worth $95,000. I walked out of that hospital with my hands shaking because I knew now that Malik's name had rewritten more than my family. It had rewritten policy across state lines. One night, while flying back from Chicago, I stared out the window at the stars and thought about how far this story had come. I thought about Vivian and Bernard sitting in their house stripped of their illusions. I thought about Chantal rebuilding a life from splinters. I thought about Malik and the way he used to laugh so hard at cartoons that he fell off the couch, and I smiled through tears because I knew he would have been proud of what his story had done. Near the end of the year, I was invited to a small gathering hosted by one of our partner hospitals. It was a quiet event, no media and no gala, just families and staff sharing stories around tables covered in paper tablecloths and hand-drawn decorations. Children danced around a musician playing songs with a ukulele, and string lights blinked above us like soft constellations. I sat with a group of parents, and when it was my turn to speak, I told them this was never about being strong, it was about surviving long enough to matter. I told them that sometimes the only thing that keeps you going is the sound of your child's laughter in your memory. And that was enough. I did not cry, not because I was numb, but because I had already cried enough to fill oceans, and now all that remained was the steady tide of resolve. After the event, I walked outside into the cold night air and looked up at the stars. I whispered his name, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was chasing his ghost. I felt like I was walking with it, side by side, into whatever came next. When winter crept in again and the days grew shorter, I found myself retreating more often into silence, not because I was overwhelmed, but because quiet had become sacred, a space to breathe, to reflect, to process the waves of life and memory that never fully stopped moving. The Resilience Network was operating in 9 cities now with more planning to launch in the coming year. And while the workload increased, so did the impact. I had learned to balance the emotional weight by creating boundaries, something I never understood before grief forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. I was still hands-on, visiting hospitals, talking to parents, attending board meetings, but I had hired a small team of people I trusted who brought both compassion and discipline to the mission. One of them was a woman named Tasha, a former oncology nurse who had lost her own child 10 years earlier. She had found her way to us through an article online, and when we met she looked me in the eyes and said, "I know this road. I know it better than I ever wanted to." I hired her the next day, and she quickly became the heartbeat of our team, balancing logistics with empathy, fierce when she needed to be soft when mattered. The families loved her, the hospitals respected her, and I relied on her more than I expected to. One evening, after a particularly long strategy session, we stayed behind in the office sipping lukewarm coffee, surrounded by sticky notes and spreadsheets. Tasha looked at me and asked, "Do you ever feel guilty for surviving when they did not?" I nodded slowly, not even pretending. I did not understand the question. "Every day," I said, "but I also feel grateful because every step we take forward feels like pulling one more child out of the fire." And she smiled, that tired, knowing smile, the one only those who have lost truly recognize. We sat in silence after that, not needing to say more. That winter brought snowstorms and headlines, both some targeting the broken systems we were trying to change, others circling back to my story, dissecting it again for clicks. But I did not engage. I did not post statements or respond to provocations. I let the noise pass like wind through a field. It had no power here, not anymore. While my parents remained absent from everything, they had not reached out, not through letters, not through calls, not even through mutual contacts. I learned through the grapevine that Bernard had taken up woodworking, of all things, carving birdhouses and benches in a retirement village far from the city. Someone said he had started attending grief counseling, though never mentioned my name or Malik. Vivian had reportedly sold the estate and moved to a coastal town where she volunteered at a botanical garden, spending her days tending to orchids and avoiding conversations about the past. I felt no bitterness, only distance, like a chapter long closed, no longer part of the book. Chantal, on the other hand, surprised me. She reached out again around the holidays, not asking forgiveness but offering help. She said she wanted to fund one of the satellite centers under Malik's name to honor the nephew. She never truly knew, she admitted. It would not erase what happened, and she did not expect it to. But she wanted to build something better with what time and wealth she still had. I thought about it for a week, spoke with Tasha and a few of our legal advisors, then finally agreed with very specific boundaries. No credit, no headlines, no public relations campaigns, just quiet contribution and impact. We opened that center in Phoenix 2 months later, and it became one of our busiest branches, serving over 50 families in its first quarter. I did not attend the launch, but I sent a photo of Malik to be placed in the lobby, a simple frame, no inscription, just his smile beaming out across a room filled with hope. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, I found myself painting again, something I had not done in years. The canvas was large, messy, chaotic, but it felt good to lose myself in color and shape, to let my hands move without purpose or plan. I filled the walls of my apartment with those paintings, some abstract, some childlike, some deeply emotional. I had no plans to sell them, no dreams of galleries. They were just for me, and for Malik, a visual language of grief and growth, and the places in between. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and sketch an idea by the light of the moon, as if the stories inside me had learned new ways to speak. I also began writing not public essays or memoirs, but private letters to my son, telling him about the people I met, the battles we won, the days I struggled, and the nights I dreamed of holding his hand again. I kept them in a notebook tucked in the drawer beside my bed, never rereading them, just writing and closing the page as a kind of prayer in motion. The work we were doing continued to spread. By summer, the network had expanded into 12 cities, and several major hospitals had agreed to adopt parts of our model internally without waiting for state legislation to catch up. One congresswoman even quoted our impact during a floor speech advocating for a national pediatric emergency fund. and though I watched it online with no expression, something inside me stirred like a heartbeat stronger than before. We had become something larger than revenge, larger than grief. We had become a force, and forces move things sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. One morning, while preparing for a trip to Seattle, I received a package on my doorstep with no return label, just my name scrawled in black ink. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity eventually won out. Inside was a simple wooden box and a letter. The handwriting was familiar, shaking slightly, but unmistakable. It was from Bernard. He wrote that he had heard about the work I was doing, and that he had nothing left to offer but truth. He admitted to prioritizing appearance over people, status over substance, and that it had cost him everything. He said he thought often about Malik, about the last conversation we had, and how my words had haunted him. He enclosed a small wooden carving of a hummingbird, and wrote that it was the first thing he had made after months of therapy, that it was imperfect like him, but crafted with hands that finally understood loss. He ended the letter by saying he did not expect a reply, only hoped that someday I would find peace. I stared at the carving for a long time, then placed it on my windowsill beside Malik's photo. The bird seemed to shimmer in the morning light, its wings frozen mid-flight. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel something unexpected, not forgiveness, but release. The burden was no longer mine to carry. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made even the wind feel heavy, and though the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, I felt a strange calm settling over my life, a sense that the storm had passed and left something solid in its wake. I spent mornings walking by the river, coffee in hand, letting the sun warm my skin and the world move around me without expectation. The resilience network was stable now, not perfect, but strong enough to stand without my constant watch. I had learned how to lead without controlling, how to delegate without fear, and the people around me had risen to meet mission with courage and care. I had also started speaking at smaller events, not for headlines, but for connection, gatherings of social workers, student nurses, grief counselors, and caregivers. I told them stories, not statistics, shared what it meant to sit beside a hospital bed with nothing but hope, and what it meant to lose and still move forward. One evening, after speaking at a university panel, a young man approached me outside. He looked barely 20, wide-eyed and trembling, and he said, "I want to help, but I do not know how." I told him helping was not always big. It was not always loud. Sometimes it meant showing up, sitting quietly, listening, holding space when others could not. He nodded and left with tears in his eyes, and I never saw him again, but I hoped he had found a path that made him feel useful, that made him feel like he mattered in the same way I had once needed to feel. Meanwhile, media had moved on, as I knew they would. New stories, new scandals, new tragedies. My name no longer filled headlines, and Malik's face no longer circled social feeds. And while that hurt in some ways, it also brought a kind of peace, like being released from a spotlight that had never asked for the truth, only for drama and clicks. I did not miss it. I did not want it back. What I wanted was quiet progress, and I was getting that every day. Our internal reports showed that over 400 children had received full treatment through our fund, over 200 families had avoided medical bankruptcy, and nearly 90 hospitals had altered their intake process to better accommodate emergency referrals that used to take weeks, now took hours, not because we had reinvented medicine, but because we had exposed the cruelty of delay and demanded better. One morning, I sat in my office with Tasher reviewing case updates. When she paused and looked at me carefully, she said, "Do you ever think about writing a book?" I laughed at first. The idea felt indulgent, unnecessary. But she said, "Not about you, not about your pain, about this, about all of this, the systems, the solutions, the blueprints, so others can build their own even if we are not there to guide them." I thought about that for a long time and slowly began collecting notes. Not a memoir, not a tale of loss, but a manual disguised as a story, something that could slip into the hands of someone desperate and show them a way through. During this time, I also reconnected with an old friend from college, Rachel. We had drifted apart years ago, lost touch as adulthood took over, but she reached out after seeing a podcast interview I had done, and we met for lunch. It was awkward at first, like two people trying to walk backward into the past, but soon the rhythm returned, and we laughed like we had in our 20s, not to forget pain, but to remember joy. Rachel was steady, kind, patient, in a way that felt earned, not forced. She did not ask for pieces of me I could not give, she just showed up again, and over time something gentle grew between us, not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but a companionship that felt like sunlight through heavy curtains. And for the first time in a long time I did not feel alone. We spent weekends at farmers' markets, bookstores, long walks with no destination. Sometimes she would help me at resilience events, taking photos, volunteering quietly, always content to stay behind the scenes. One night, while watching a documentary, she turned to me and asked what would Malik have become. I swallowed hard and thought for a moment. He would have been kind. I said the kind of kid who helped the quiet one in class or brought home stray animals. He would have made people feel safe. And she nodded and said, then he already did, you just carried it forward. I did not respond, just held that thought like a gift, because she was right. He had become something more than one life, more than one story. He had become a reason for change, and that mattered. Later that year, as autumn approached, we hosted our first national summit for pediatric care reform. No gala, no suits, just doctors, nurses, advocates, and survivors coming together to build solutions. The agenda was simple: share what works, confront what fails, and commit to leaving no child behind. I opened the event with a short speech, nothing rehearsed, just my heart in my hands. I told them that we were not here because of policy or politics, but because too many lives had been weighed against cost and found lacking, and that had to end. I told them about Malik, about his laughter and bravery, and how one decision, one refusal to help had sparked all of this. And I told them that every single person in that room had the power to prevent the next Malik from being a headline instead of a heartbeat. They stood and clapped, not for me, but for the mission, and I felt something crack open inside, a release, a letting go, like maybe I had finally done enough. Maybe now I could breathe again. The summit led to new partnerships, new funding streams, and a pilot program with federal health agencies that would test our model in 3 rural states, places where children often died not from disease but from distance and delay. It was not a solution, but it was a start, and I was proud of that. As the leaves turned and the air cooled, I returned home one evening to find a small envelope tucked under my door. There was no name, just a stamped return address from the coastal town where Vivian had moved. Inside was a folded card with a photo of orchids and a note in her familiar, precise handwriting. She wrote, I do not expect you to forgive us, but I wanted you to know I tend the gardens every morning, and I planted one in Malik's name. I chose the rarest bloom, the one that needs the most care, because I thought maybe that is what we never gave him, and I am sorry every day. I am sorry. I closed the note and sat with it for a long time, not crying, not angry, just still. And then I placed it inside the box with Bernard's carving and thought, perhaps this was as close to reconciliation as we would ever get. Not spoken, not shared, just gestures like stones laid gently at the edge of a grave, not to mark the end, but to say we were here, we loved, we failed, we remembered. The days following that letter passed quietly, almost like the world was honoring the weight of it, and I let myself drift a little, not away from the mission, but deeper into reflection. I began walking through my neighborhood without headphones, no music, no distractions, just the sound of wind, trees, the rhythm of feet on pavement. Sometimes I would take detours into unfamiliar streets, noticing how life unfolded in small, quiet ways. A child chasing a paper plane, a man fixing a fence, an old woman feeding pigeons, each one a reminder that healing was not a destination. It was a practice, and I had become a student of it again and again. Meanwhile, the Resilience Network had grown into something I barely recognized, not because it had changed, but because it had blossomed. We had over 100 full-time volunteers now, some paid, most not, and they came from all walks of life: social workers, pediatric nurses, med students, retired therapists, even parents who had once been recipients of our help and now wanted to give back. We opened new chapters in Detroit, New Orleans, and Denver, each one tailored to the unique challenges of its region, because what worked in Manhattan did not always translate to rural Arkansas or the outskirts of Albuquerque, and that was the beauty of the model it adapted. It listened, it served rather than dictated. We had built it that way on purpose, and now it lived beyond me, a living, breathing organism, powered by purpose and pain transformed into action. We were even invited to speak at an international conference on nonprofit innovation hosted in Toronto, where I delivered a keynote in front of hundreds of attendees. The speech was short, honest, vulnerable. I told them our story, not just mine, but the collective story of every child we had touched and every parent who had been told no and still fought back. I ended by saying, we are not here to shame the system, we are here to change it, because shame is passive. But change is not. The applause was loud, but I heard only the quiet voice inside me, the one that used to scream and now whispered, keep going. One of the attendees, a woman named Lucia, approached me afterwards. She was from Spain and ran a similar network in Madrid, and we sat in the lobby for hours swapping stories, learning from each other, laughing at the absurdity of bureaucracy and crying over the universality of loss. She invited me to visit and speak at her center, and though I had never left the country since Malik's passing, I found myself saying yes, maybe, because the world felt a little safer now, or maybe because I wanted to see how far this ripple had traveled. That visit happened 3 months later, and it was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. I walked into a clinic filled with color, laughter, and resilience, and saw murals of children painted on walls, their names, their stories, their victories. Lucia introduced me to a mother whose child had survived leukemia through one of their programs, and that mother hugged me as if we had known each other for years and whispered in broken English, thank you for not giving up. And I realized then that grief had no borders, and neither did hope. When I returned home, the air felt different, not because the city had changed, but because I spent more time with Rachel, who by now had become a constant in my life. We were not lovers, not quite, but we were something deeper than friendship. She had seen the worst of my silence and never walked away. She had held space when I had nothing to give, and in that quiet trust we had found something sacred. One night we sat on my rooftop watching the skyline flicker, and she said, if you ever decide to stop all of this, what would you do? And I thought for a moment, then answered, I would still find a way to serve, maybe not through policy or programs, maybe just through presence, through being the kind of person who shows up when it matters. And she smiled and said, then you already are, and I believed her. A few weeks later, we held our annual remembrance gathering where families came together to honor the children they had lost. We lit candles, released lanterns, and read their names one by one. And when I read Malik's name, I did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because I had finally accepted that grief and gratitude could live in the same breath. I looked around at the crowd and saw Tasha holding a baby she had helped place in a foster home, Lucia visiting from Spain hugging parents she had just met, Rachel documenting moments with gentle eyes, and I knew without a doubt that Malik was still here, not in the way I wanted, but in the way the world needed, and that had to be enough. After the event, I sat alone in the empty hall, surrounded by the flicker of dying candles, and thought about the journey. Moments that almost broke me, the people who walked away, the ones who stayed the nights I could not sleep, the mornings I did not want to wake. And yet here I was not just breathing, but building, and I whispered into the silence, we are okay now, we are okay. The next morning, I received a call from a local news outlet. They wanted to do a piece on the impact of the Resilience Network, not sensational, not investigative, just a profile of hope, and I said yes, but only if the focus was on the people, not me. They agreed, and the piece aired 2 weeks later, featuring interviews with volunteers, parents, doctors, and even children. One clip showed a little girl with a shaved head holding a drawing of a heart and saying, I am strong because they believed in me. And I cried watching that, not with sadness, but with awe, because belief was everything, and that child had reminded me of it in the simplest way possible. A few days after the broadcast, I received a letter, not from Vivian, not from Bernard, but from someone I never expected to hear, from a former classmate of Malik's, now a teenager who had been silent all these years. He wrote that he remembered Malik as the kindest boy in school, the one who stood up for others, who shared his lunch, who always smiled even when others did not notice. He said he had followed our story in the background, unsure what to say or do, but now felt compelled to tell me that Malik had changed his life and that he was studying to become a pediatric nurse because of him. I folded the letter and placed it beside the hummingbird and the orchid note, three small tokens of something bigger than apology or closure. They were proof that one life could echo across time, across pain, across silence. They were proof that Malik mattered. The seasons shifted once more, and with winter came a stillness that was both familiar and foreign. I found myself waking earlier not out of necessity, but because the silence before dawn had become a companion, the kind that did not ask questions or demand answers. It simply existed beside me like a shadow. I brewed tea instead of coffee, wrapped myself in a blanket, and stared out the window at a city that had survived itself just as I had. Sometimes I would think about the early days, the rage, the despair, the isolation, and marvel at how far we had come, not just as an organization, but as individuals molded by grief and fire, but standing anyway. One morning, as snow began to dust the streets, I received a call from a production company. They had seen the news segment and wanted to explore a documentary, not a dramatization, but a deeply human portrayal of what it meant to fight for child's life in a system designed to forget the poor and favor the privileged. I was hesitant, wary of being turned into content. But after several conversations with the director, a quiet woman named Elise, who had once been a hospice nurse before picking up a camera, I agreed. We made a pact that nothing would be fabricated, nothing would be staged. The truth was enough. The pain was real. The victory was real, and the in-between where most of life existed was more powerful than any fiction. Over the next 6 months, Elise and her team followed our journey. They filmed late-night strategy calls, tearful parent support circles, chaotic emergency referrals, and quiet moments of joy, like when a child who had just finished chemo danced barefoot in our community room to a Taylor Swift song, not knowing or caring that the world was watching. And they captured me not just as a leader, but as a person, sitting alone at a desk rereading Malik's medical files, as if somehow the words would rearrange themselves into a different ending. And I let them see that because it mattered to me, that the world understood this fight was not about statistics. It was about sons and daughters, about siblings, and smiles that never got to grow up. During this time, Rachel stayed close, offering support without expectation. She never asked what the cameras saw or what the world thought of me. She simply kept showing up. One evening, we sat on the couch, the footage from Elise playing quietly on her laptop, and Rachel said, "You look like someone carrying both the world and the weight of letting it go." And I knew what she meant, because grief never really leaves. It just stops shouting and starts whispering. And you learn to live with the echo. The documentary, released in late spring, titled No Cost Too Great, and it stunned me with its reach. It aired in over 20 countries and was translated into 11 languages, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest and raw. And at the heart of it was Malik, not as a symbol, but as a boy who should have lived, who should have had birthday cakes and high school dances and all the ordinary moments that money should never be allowed to deny. And with that exposure came both blessings and burdens. Donations poured in, volunteers tripled, new medical partners emerged, but so did criticism from those who believed we were painting the healthcare system in too dark light. And I had to remind myself that telling the truth was not the same as tearing something down. It was laying the foundation to build something better. And that was what we did. We expanded our telehealth pilot, reaching children in Alaska, Mississippi, and parts of rural Kansas where pediatric care had once been 6 hours away by car. We launched emergency transit programs, so no parent ever had to choose between rent and an ambulance. And we built a network of mental health providers who offered trauma counseling to families drowning in fear and debt. But the greatest change came from within. Hospitals began calling us not to negotiate, but to ask how they could replicate our triage model. One director even admitted after watching the documentary that he had reshaped his department's intake protocol because he finally saw the human cost of delay, and I held on to that like a lifeline. Because if one heart could shift one policy, then maybe we were not just healing symptoms, maybe we were curing disease on the structural level. And that was worth every tear, every battle, every sleepless night. One morning, I visited Malik's grave. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I had not been Avoiding it, not exactly. I had just been afraid that seeing his name etched in stone would undo me, but it did not. Instead, I sat beside the marker, ran my fingers over each letter, and told him everything. Told him about Rachel and Lucia, about Tasha's new baby, and Bernard's silence, about Vivian's letter, and the little girl with the shaved head who had drawn him as a superhero in crayon. I told him about the summit and the Spanish clinic, and the boy from school who became a nurse. And then I said the words I had once thought I never could. We are okay now, not perfect, not healed, but okay, and I swear I felt something shift, not the wind, not the earth, just something inside me uncoil, release, like maybe I could finally let go of the guilt and just hold on to the love, because that was what he deserved, not my sorrow, but my strength. That afternoon, I met with the board to finalize plans for our first scholarship initiative named after Malik. It would fund education for aspiring pediatric nurses from underrepresented communities, kids who knew what it meant to struggle and still want to serve. It felt right, like a full circle, like planting seeds in soil that had once only known grief. And as I signed the final documents, I looked at his name on the letterhead and whispered, "Thank you for guiding me. Even in absence, you were never gone, not really. You just changed form." A few weeks later, Rachel and I took a trip to the coast, a quiet cabin near the sea. No agenda, no phone calls, no calendars. We spent mornings watching waves and evenings reading on the porch, and in between we talked about everything and nothing. One night, under a sky thick with stars, she said, "Do you ever think about what your life would have looked like if none of this had happened?" And I paused, because it was a cruel question, not because she meant it that way, but because I had asked it of myself 1,000 times, and the answer was always the same. I would have had him, but I would not have known this purpose, and that is the impossible math of grief. It takes and gives, and you never break even. And she nodded and said, "Then maybe we stop doing the math and just live." And I kissed her then, not out of romance, but out of gratitude, and she understood without needing it explained. And in that moment I knew that whatever came next, I would face it not as a broken man searching for justice, but as a whole man carrying love forward, and that would be enough. The summer that followed was the most peaceful I had known in years, and it was not because the world had changed, but because I had stopped waiting for it to give me permission to feel alive again. I began gardening, which surprised even me, because I had never seen myself as someone who found joy in soil, but there was something grounding about it, about planting something small and watching it grow, about nurturing life with patience instead of force. I grew tomatoes, bell peppers, lavender, and a single stubborn rose bush that refused to bloom until late July, when one blood-red petal finally opened. Like a silent victory, Rachel would laugh every time I came in with dirt under my nails and say, "Look at you, Mr. Urban Farmer," and I would pretend to grumble, but deep down, I cherished those moments. They reminded me that life did not have to be loud to be meaningful. During this time, our network footprint expanded again, this time into tribal lands in Arizona and South Dakota, where children had long been denied consistent care due to infrastructure gaps and institutional neglect. We partnered with tribal leaders not as saviors, but as students, asking what they needed and listening more than we spoke, and in doing so we built trust programs and pipelines that respected culture while delivering care. Our approach was not perfect, but it was evolving, and evolution was the only way to stay true to our mission. I also began mentoring a group of high school students interested in nonprofit leadership. Once a week, I met with them over video calls, and we talked about everything from grant writing to emotional burnout. And one boy named Levy said something that stuck with me. He said, "Sometimes I think the system wants us to fail quietly, so it does not have to change." And I told him then, "Raise your voice until it has no choice." And I saw something light up in his eyes, that same fire I had once carried alone, but now shared with a generation that refused to settle for less. One evening in August, Rachel brought over a scrapbook she had been quietly building for months. Inside were photographs, clippings, letters, drawings from children, and notes from families. Some I knew, others were strangers who had written in after watching the documentary or reading about our work. One page held a drawing of Malik with angel wings holding hands with a girl in a hospital gown. They were both smiling beneath a rainbow, and the caption in shaky handwriting read, I think they are friends in heaven, and I could not hold back the tears, not out of sorrow, but from the depth of love captured in crayon lines. I hugged Rachel tighter than I ever had before and whispered thank you, and she said no. Thank you for giving pain a purpose that night. I dreamed of Malik, not the frail boy in a hospital bed, but the vibrant child running through sprinklers laughing, covered in sunlight, and I woke up smiling for the first time in years. The very next day, I received an unexpected call from Vivian. Her voice was different, softer, but still guarded. She said she had watched the documentary and read about the scholarship, and asked if we could talk. I agreed cautiously, and we met at a small cafe downtown, the same one where I used to bring Malik for hot chocolate during winter break. She looked older, more tired, but also more human, and for a moment we just stared at each other, unsure how to begin. Finally, she said I was wrong, and I do not know how to live with that, and I replied, you do not live with it, you live through it, and then we see what is left. She told me about the years since, about Bernard's slow withdrawal, about how the lavishness that once filled their lives now felt like noise, and how every time she saw a boy with curly hair she thought of Malik. She said, I know you may never forgive me, but I wanted you to know I carry it every day. And I said, I am not here to forgive, I am here to listen, because maybe that is all we can do now. She nodded, and we sat for hours talking about things we had buried until the sun dipped low and the streets filled with shadows. When we parted, she hugged me, not as a mother who failed, but as a woman trying to start again, and I let her because hate had no place in a heart that had already been broken and rebuilt. Later that week, Bernard reached out through email, a short message saying thank you for meeting Vivian, and I wish you peace. And I read it twice, then archived it, not because it meant nothing, but because it was not mine to carry anymore. That chapter had ended, and I had no desire to rewrite it. I focused instead on what was blooming. Our annual gala fundraiser approached, and this year we hosted it outdoors in a park, filled with lanterns strung through trees and laughter echoing into the night. The theme was legacy, and every detail from the name cards to the centerpieces honored children we had lost and those we had saved. I gave a speech shorter than usual, ending with the words, Malik taught me that love is louder than silence, and every time you choose to show up you honor a child like him. And the standing ovation that followed felt like a wave of warmth, not applause but affirmation that his story mattered, that he mattered. After the event, I walked through the park alone, the lanterns swaying in the breeze, and I imagined each one carrying a message into the sky, a thank you, a prayer, a promise. I closed my eyes, listened not for voices, but for the stillness that came after healing, the kind that did not need permission to exist, only space. And I realized then that I had made peace not just with the past, but with the present, with the knowledge that I had done everything I could, and that sometimes that was all anyone could do. I returned home that night and found Rachel asleep on the couch, our cat curled beside her, the television still playing a silent loop of old nature footage, and I sat beside her brushing a strand of hair from her face and whispered, we are okay, and she stirred but did not wake, and I knew that was enough. In the days that followed, we finalized our plans to open a residential pediatric care center, one that offered not just treatment but dignity, a place where families could stay together, where playrooms and palliative care coexisted, where the walls held stories, not just sadness. We named it the Malik Center, and when we broke ground in early September, parents and children, volunteers and donors all gathered wearing shirts that read "No child should be a price tag," and I stood before them holding the first shovel, feeling the weight and wonder of a journey that began with loss, never ended with it. And as I drove home that afternoon, Rachel held my hand and said he would be proud, and I smiled because I finally believed that was true. The day the Malik Center officially opened its doors was one of those mornings that felt touched by something sacred. The sky was pale and soft like brushed cotton, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees, as if nature itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. People began arriving early, some dressed in suits, others in t-shirts bearing Malik's name, and some in hospital scrubs, still smelling faintly of antiseptic. There were parents clutching photos, children in wheelchairs holding balloons, and elderly volunteers guiding families toward the welcome table. The center itself stood quiet and proud, 3 stories of curved glass and pale stone, with a sculpture garden at the front and murals painted by local artists on its side. The entrance path was lined with potted orchids and hummingbird carvings, both symbols that had come to define not just our journey, but Malik's spirit. And I stood near the front doors. I saw Tasha approaching holding hands with a teenage boy who had once been a patient, and she smiled the kind of smile that said everything without needing to speak. I hugged her tightly and whispered, "We made it." And she replied, "You made it." And I said, "No, we did." And we both laughed with eyes full of tears. When Rachel arrived carrying a guest book bound in navy leather, I felt a calm settle over me. She handed it to me and said ready, and I nodded, though ready was not the right word. It was more like present, fully, completely open to what this day meant to everyone who had ever walked with us. We began the ceremony with music, soft strings played by students from the local high school, followed by a poem written by a child in remission who described healing as a house with no locked doors. Then I stepped up to the podium to speak, not as a founder or a leader, but as it. "Father," I said, "this place was born from heartbreak, but it lives because of hope." I said, "Every brick was laid by hands that refused to let grief win, and every room inside was designed to say you belong here." I shared a story about Malik that few knew, how he used to hum when he was nervous, a soft, gentle melody with no words, just sound, and how now when I walk these halls, I still hear that hum like a thread running through the silence, keeping him close. When I finished, the crowd was silent for a beat, and then applause rose slowly, steady, not loud, but deep and lasting. Afterward, we invited guests to tour the center, and I walked with a group that included Lucia from Spain, a senator who had quietly supported our funding, and two mothers who had both lost sons within weeks of each other last year. We moved through the main hallway, lined with portraits of children, past and present, each photo framed in warm wood beneath plaques etched with quotes or memories. One read, "He made us laugh even when we were scared," and another said, "She never stopped singing, not even on the hardest day." The playroom was filled with light, and painted with clouds and paper birds that hung from the ceiling. The medical wing was lined with calming lights and sensory murals designed to ease anxiety. The family dorms had beds, books, private bathrooms, and balcony views of a small garden where wind chimes hung in trees, and in the center of the facility stood the reflection room, a circular space with a skylight at the top and walls covered in soft fabric where anyone could sit, cry, pray, or just breathe. It was Rachel's idea, and it had quickly become the heart of the center. In that room, I found Bernard quietly standing near the window, his eyes fixed on the sky. I had not known he would come, but I was not surprised. Either he looked thinner, older, his hair more gray than I remembered, and when he turned to see me, we just looked at each other for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I almost did not come, but something told me I needed to." And I said, "I am glad you did." He nodded and added, "I still do not understand how I could have been so blind." And I said, "Pain clouds everything, but sometimes love clears it." Again, he asked if he could see the orchid. Malik had planted the original one from our garden, and I led him to the courtyard where it now lived in a glass case with a small plaque that read, "Still blooming," and he stared at it. I saw his shoulders sink, not from defeat but release, and he whispered, "I am sorry, son." And I left him there alone, because some moments are meant to be silent. That evening, as the sun began to fall golden across the courtyard, we held our final act of the day, a lantern release. Family staff visitors all gathered with biodegradable lanterns, each marked with names, wishes, memories, and as the first ones lifted, I saw colors dance across the sky like Malik's laughter had returned in light. Rachel held my hand, and we watched them rise until they disappeared into the clouds. Afterward, we stayed back, cleaning, resetting, walking the grounds, until only a few staff remained, and when we finally locked the doors and turned off the lights, the building did not feel empty. It felt like it was holding something sacred, something earned. The days that followed brought a wave of attention. Media outlets, articles, social media, shares, donations, and letters, thousands of letters from across the world. Stories of children who had died, children who had survived, families who had been abandoned by their own and found comfort in ours. One letter came from a girl in Brazil who had survived leukemia. With help from a small clinic inspired by our model, she wrote, "I think Malik saved me too," and I placed that letter on my desk beside the first one I ever received from the insurance company that had denied him all those years ago, a symbol of how far we had come from silence to voice, from pain to Power. I also received a call from my old boss, the one who had once told me to move on. And he said I was wrong. I see that now, and I replied I know you were, and I forgive you, and that was the end of that chapter. No bitterness, just closure. Rachel and I took a week off for the first time in years. We drove upstate to a cabin surrounded by woods and stars. No phones, no news, just quiet. We cooked together, read in silence. And one night she asked if I had ever thought about writing a book. I told her I had, but only if it was honest, and she said then it will matter, and I started writing that very night. Not a memoir, but a series of letters to Malik about everything he had missed, everything he had inspired. I wrote about his tree in the park, the scholarship, his favorite nurse, who now trained others, the laughter he left behind in so many places. I wrote until the sun came up, and I kept writing long after we returned home, because some stories refuse to be silenced, some voices echo, even when the body is gone, and Malik's voice had become the heartbeat of a movement. Time moved differently after the opening of the Malik Center, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis, not dramatically, not with noise, but in the quiet way grief becomes part of your blood, a silent companion that no longer burns but whispers. I continued my work each day, not because I had, but because I was still speaking to my son through every family. I helped every child I watched heal, every broken parent who looked into my eyes and saw not a stranger, but someone who understood completely. I kept writing letters to Malik, not because he needed them, but because I did the act of it. Grounded me, helped me remember not just the pain, but the laughter, the smell of his shampoo, the way he used to mimic cartoon voices, or how he once tried to build a robot out of cereal boxes and duct tape. I wrote one letter every week, sealed them, and placed them in a wooden box beside his photograph. And over time that box grew heavier with love. Then one day something unexpected happened again. Rachel and I were in the reflection room reviewing artwork submissions for the next exhibit, when a young woman approached. She introduced herself as Dana, a college student studying nonprofit law, and she said, "I know this sounds strange, but I think you knew my mother." And I asked who she was, and she gave the name I had not heard in years, the receptionist from my old job, the one who had slipped that envelope onto my desk when no one else dared. She told me her mother passed away from cancer 2 years ago, but she had followed our story from the beginning. She said her mother spoke of me often, not with pity, but with pride, and that on her deathbed she told Dana, "Make sure you find him one day and tell him he changed the world." And now she had. I stood there frozen, not by pain, but by the way life sometimes brings back kindness like a boomerang thrown years ago, returning quietly and perfectly on time. Dana asked if she could intern at the center, and I said of course, then offered her a full-time position the following month. The circle felt complete in a way I had never expected. I also received word that the hospital which once denied Malik was under new leadership. The CEO, who had signed the final refusal, had quietly resigned and been replaced by a woman named Dr. Lena Ramos, who had spent a decade advocating for equal pediatric funding in underserved communities. She invited me to speak at their ethics panel, not as an enemy, but as a catalyst. She said, "Your story changed more than you know." And when I arrived at that hospital, for the first time since that terrible day, I felt the ghosts begin to fade. The halls were the same, but the air was different. Staff greeted me not with shame, with curiosity, and when I stood before the panel, I told them I was not there for revenge. I was there to remind them that behind every denial was a child with a name, with a laugh, with a future that deserved more than policy and paperwork. I left that day lighter than I had arrived later, that winter. Rachel and I sat in the garden behind the center watching snow fall onto the sculptures and wind chimes when she turned to me and said, "I think he would be proud," and I replied, "I know he is." And for the first time I truly believed it. We spent New Year's Eve inside with candles and old movies, and at midnight I whispered, "Happy New Year, Malik," and kissed his photo on the shelf. The years that followed brought growth, expansion. More centers, more families helped, more names etched into our wall of remembrance. And one morning, as I watched a group of volunteers plant flowers in the courtyard, I felt something inside me shift, a calm, a peace, not of forgetting, but of living fully within the memory without being consumed by it. I knew then that I had done what I came to do. I had honored my son not with rage, but with a legacy that would outlive both of us, and so, in the spring of 2025, I stepped down from daily operations not to vanish but to pass the torch. I handed the keys to Dana, who had become a fierce, compassionate leader, and I told her do not try to be me, be better, and she promised she would. I still visit often, sometimes to speak, sometimes just to walk the halls and touch the walls that remember his laughter, and each time I see a child playing, or a nurse smiling, or a parent breathing deeply for the first time, I know that Malik's story still lives on. Sometimes I sit beneath his tree in the garden, the one with wind chimes that sing with every breeze, and I write a new letter, one that starts with "Today was a good day" and ends with "Thank you for choosing me to be your dad." And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind is right, I feel his presence not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a part of the very air I breathe. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.